So when I moved to Dallas, I dealt in minerals. I didn't really know that much about gemstones. And it wasn't too long before someone referred me over to Ray Zajicek. I frankly was fairly ignorant about the gemstone market, AGTA, the American Gem Trade Association. And it was really interesting because Ray's perspective is based on decades of having traveled to a country, in this case Colombia, during the time both the gem and the mineral market was developing. And I learned so much from Ray that has influenced how I have tried to take the mineral world based on the direction the gemstone world of colored gemstones went when he and a group of his friends incorporated the American Gem Trade Association 40 years ago. And he and his son Monte have lived through those changes. And we've gotten to know this family. They're great people. They've been involved in the emerald business for decades. And we're going to hear a really personal perspective from inside the emerald industry in Colombia, told by Monte Zajicek here.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everybody. My name is Monte Zajicek, and my company is Equatorian Imports. I'm honored to be here today. Rob had kind of put me to the test a couple years ago and had me do a smaller version of this speech to a smaller crowd, and I guess I passed this test, so he wanted me to come back here and tell the longer version. Everybody always wants to get Ray to tell the story, but that's usually not possible, so you guys get me, and hopefully I'll be able to do a good job telling his stories to you guys, keeping you entertained. Okay, so as Rob also told me, he said no science for me, because I am not a scientist, and I'm not a geologist, I'm not a mineralogist. What my speech is going to be cover is hunting Colombian emeralds. What I am is an emerald salesman, and I make my living selling colored gemstones to the trade. The goal of my speech is to give you perspective into the emerald trade using a little bit of history, some insider's view on how they are brought to market, and most importantly, I hope to convey more appreciation on how these stones make it from deep in the Andes Mountains to their final homes across the globe. So, let's see. We're going to start off with a little bit of history. But first, I'd like to say Colombian emeralds have been on a very unique and fascinating journey. Look around you. Just like every one of you, they have come a very, very long way to be here. And I don't just mean a 5.5-hour ride from Bogota to Dallas, but pushing their way through layers of rock and soil, fighting to remain intact, to be discovered, or perhaps born, one might say, traveling down the valleys, back up into the mountains, making their way onto the streets of Bogota, where they are there sawed, preformed, cut, polished, enhanced, graded, traded, and eventually sold to be exported and imported into the US, sold again to hopefully the retail jeweler or jewelry designer, and then eventually making their way into your collections and your hearts. Colombian emeralds, just like us, are on a very unique and fascinating journey. So to better appreciate that journey, let's start with a little bit of some history. Let's see if I can get this to work. A fascinating and violent history of Colombia. Is anybody here from Colombia? No? Good, because they're not going to like this part. So, okay, so I'm a movie fan, and I like films that are kind of like non-linear. They jump around a little bit, so I'm going to be jumping around in some timetables here, but if you follow along with me, it's about to get pretty good. So Colombian emeralds, they come from two different mines primarily. The most famous is Muzo, and the second most famous is Chivor. Remember these names as I'm going to be referring to them often. For over 4,000 years, emeralds have been cherished as some of the most valuable jewels on earth. In the 16th century, Spanish conquerors sought out these magical stones from the Incas, who were known to have used emeralds in their religious ceremonies for at least 400 years prior to that. The Spanish began to trade their precious metals of gold and silver for the green gems. And they eventually and reluctantly persuaded the Incas to take them to the source deep into the region of Boyaca, which is a lush, dense, mountainous region full of valleys and rivers north of Bogota. In 1537, Spanish conqueror Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, this guy, saw the first sign of emeralds in Boyaca. He then sent out one of his commanders, a guy by the name of Pedro F. de Valenzuela, to find the source, where in that same year he located the Chibcha Indian mine called Somondoco, which would later be renamed to Chivor after a nearby valley. Actual mining of the Muzo mines did not start occurring until 30 years later in 1567. But by the end of the 16th century, both Chivor and Muzo were being vigorously worked using Indian slave labor. Okay, so by 1593, Colombian President Gonzalo issues a decree to try and help the Indian population from being exploited. But sadly, by that point, they had already had their population decimated by the practice of slave labor. After an official ban from the King of Spain and in order to actually try and enforce the law, the Spanish, along with their loss of cheap labor, saw the production of Colombian emeralds decline for the next 50 years. By 1675, the Chivor mine had been abandoned, and its location would become a mystery that would endure for almost 200 years. It would later be found by a priest, I believe, as the story goes, had seen it written on the back of a letter describing the views to what the outside of the mines looked like, and they would set off to find it later on in the, I believe, the 1800s again. Muzo would eventually be worked sporadically through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. In 1871, the Colombian government declared Muzo to be national emerald domain. And after this declaration, production all but ceased and mining fell into lawlessness and chaos with a multi-tiered hierarchy of groups all fighting for their piece of the action. This remained almost unchanged for close to 100 years. Now, we're going to jump up to about the 1960s. At this point, the Colombian government starts awarding 5-year leases to the different operating mines. There were about 6 or 7 mining companies at the time that were all vying to basically purchase rights in order to go and mine different areas of the Muzo mine. And this was a highly competitive thing, and as I'm sure you could imagine, there was a lot of bribery and swindling going on, basically. I'm going to go off the script here. So companies would entice workers to the region because there were very few opportunities for uneducated men as well as those in the city. So they would all make their way up to Boyaca to try their hand at fortune in the emerald industry. But mostly, all these men would find is loss and death. Even in the mid-20th century, this was still very much the early days of mining. Rudimentary equipment and virtually no safety provisions in place. Some were killed by the hands of their jealous co-workers over their discovery of emeralds, while others were killed by a collapsed mine. Others fell victim to dynamite blasts. Dynamiting was not popular initially with emerald mining, given how soft they are, but as companies only had 5-year leases, this encouraged rapid mining, which in turn led to the use of dynamite, losing countless amounts of emeralds as well as the lives of workers in the process. You couple this with disease and unsanitary conditions, and mining famous green gemstones proved most often to be a sure way to find a quick death. Scroll through these. This is a slide of Quipama. Quipama is an area or region 200 miles northeast of Bogota. Sometimes people refer to Quipama as Muzo itself because it's very close to where the mine is actually located. This is a picture of the Chivor Mine in the 1980s. These are all mostly my dad's old photos. I can guarantee you that it looks the same right now. Some more photos. That's my dad on the right, doing some exploring. This shows you what a lot of the camps look like down at the mines where the Guaqueros and some of the miners would set up their operations and hunt for the emeralds. Okay, now let's pause on our history here for a moment and let's think about what I've told you. Emeralds have been sought after and fought over for centuries, and for centuries, many tears were shed over the death of loved ones in search of emeralds. Which brings me to the ancient emerald fable of Fura and Tena. In the land of the Carari, the Magdalena River, the Muzo god, Ari, swept over the area, creating mountains and valleys. On the shores of the sacred river, now called Minero, he formed 2 figures, one male, Tena, and one female, Fura, and he threw them into the river. There, they were brought to life. Once alive, Ari taught Fura and Tena how to take care of the gardens that he had planted and make pottery. He gave them rules to follow, including the requirement of fidelity in their husband and wife relationship. Ari taught them that violating these laws he had established for them would lead to aging and eventual death. For a long time, Fura and Tena enjoyed their ageless lives in the beautiful land Ade had prepared for them. Then, one day, a young man appeared. His name was Zarbi. Zarbi was looking for a flower that could cure any illness. He claimed to have crossed mountains and rivers looking high and low for the flower without success. So he asked Fura for help, and she agreed and began to follow him throughout the forest looking for the flower. Soon, however, Fura became aware of her own interests, not in the flower, but in Zarbi. She was unfaithful to Tena with Zarbi, and as a result, immediately began to age. Realizing her error, she returned to Tena, who upon seeing her in her aged state realized that she had broken the law that Ade had given them, and she would soon die. Not wanting to be left alone, Tena laid down on Fura's knees and stabbed himself in the heart. For 3 days, Fura cried with the body of her husband on her lap. Her tears changed into green rocks, emeralds. Soon, Ade returned to visit Fura and Tena and realized that his laws had been broken. He changed the couple into large rocks. Angered, he also banished Zarbi, who in his own anger changed into a raging river in order to eternally separate Fura's rock from Tena's rock. These are the rocks of Fura and Tena. This is an illustration. There is, I believe, the river that separates them at the bottom of the ravine. So it's a pretty famous story that's known throughout Colombia, and I thought you guys might find it interesting as well. Another interesting bit of information, it also is the name of the airport which services the Western Emerald region of Quipama, simply called Fura Tena. And that is the airport, hanging out at the end of a mountain cliff. I'm sure that it's a wonderful place to fly in and out of. Okay, so back to our history lesson. I'm gonna jump back to the early 1940s. Now, about this time, a young boy and his older brother were wandering the hills outside of the small town of Guateque, a village in the area of Boyaca. This is Guateque. They were from a large family of 6 and were very poor. Their mother and siblings worked on a small farm owned by somebody else, gardening vegetables and raising chickens. Their father died when the boys were only toddlers. During this walk, the older brother noticed a shiny green object sticking out of the ground. Instantly, he knew it was an emerald. Both brothers were aware of the riches it could bring to their family, as well as the danger it also represented. Hearing the emerald calling to him, like so many young men had heard before, the older brother pulled the emerald from the ground and told his younger brother that he was going to sell the emerald far away in the streets of Bogota, and he would return with enough money to support his family and buy them their own farm. The boy would never see or hear from his older brother again. And that little boy was Victor Carranza. He would eventually grow up to quickly become the most important and feared figure in the emerald trade, earning the title of the Emerald Czar of Colombia. In 1946, the Colombian government, in an effort to stem the lawlessness that had prevailed over Boyaca, handed over total control of the Muzo mines to Banco de la República, the country's national bank. They were entrusted with all mining operations as well as marketing of the emeralds. Not surprisingly, when the government takes total control, the situation only worsened. Now, keep in mind, you have several different factions at play here. You've got the national bank trying to manage the entire production and flow of emeralds, including the marketing of the emeralds back in the streets of Bogota. Underneath them, you have the competing companies, which are basically bribing officials and blackmailing other people in order to try and get their rights and their access to certain areas of the Muzo mines, which they wanted to operate. And then underneath them, you basically have like feudalist-style families and other kind of like loose affiliated like tribes and people that work together that are also miners. These independent miners, often locals of the small villages and towns of Boyaca, managed for well over 100 years, rummaging through the dirt and reject material from the mines, feeding their families and villages from the sale of the emeralds. These people are known as the Guaqueros. So oftentimes you'll see these people at the bottom of the mines sifting through basically the reject and the leftover soil that the mining companies will dump at the bottom of the river. And this has been a process that's been going on ever since they've started basically operating Muzo. And a lot of these people were indigenous or just from very small towns, and so they would come to the area in order to just sift through and find whatever remnants they can to support their families. A lot of that has since started to change because of the new mining methods that are taking place right now, currently in Muzo, in particular with, let's see, the new company that out of Texas that is running it. They've recently stopped allowing so much of the soil to be deposited back there. They've been bearing it back up onto the mountain to prevent people from going through and basically having an opportunity to rummage through the leftover emerald, so to speak. So you can kind of understand the structure and the hierarchy that's taking place. The structure is chaotic and deadly, and the National Bank realizes that most of the emerald production they're losing is to outside mining. All the time people are coming in and mining, coming in the middle of the night, busting down gates, blowing up roads and access points in order to cut off companies from reaching them, to get access points into different areas of the mine. And they realized that no matter how much control they really tried to assert over this, that there was really not a whole lot that they could do as government, and that it would be better for them to once again start awarding these contracts back out to the top mining companies that would be able to monitor the emeralds as best they could. So the structure is deadly, and they realize that most of the emeralds are being stolen out from underneath them. And there's also a large increase of violence and murder in the region. Now, monitoring the entire situation from the outside is Don Victor, forming his plan to rise to the top of the emerald food chain. Okay, so by the time the government leases started to be awarded again in the early 1970s, Victor Carranza had already made a name for himself. He had a devoted army of hundreds of armed men, followers you could say, as well as a seemingly endless supply of good luck when it came to staying alive and finding the emeralds. Just like most people would say, he said that the emeralds would call to him, and that's how he was able to have such good luck finding all the emeralds that he did. He operated independently, no formal company, with the business sense of a skilled CEO on one hand, and ruling the region like a skilled military general with the iron fist of another. When Banco de Republica gave up trying to run the Muzo mines entirely in 1977 and reverted back to selling off exploration rights, Carranza, with the help of a few partners, bought the rights from the Colombian government. Victor said that for the next 2 years, he thought his luck had run out. He couldn't find any emeralds, and he was running out of money. All the while, he's having to compete with other rival companies. He's dealing with constant assault by left-wing guerrillas known as the FARC, while also trying to keep the local tribesmen and local townspeople from feuding, trying to constantly break into the mines, break into his properties, and steal from him. Now, as you can imagine, about this time comes the rise of the cocaine industry and the cartel that follows. They were also at war with Victor. As you can imagine, the cartel industries, they really saw a wonderful opportunity to move their business through the emerald business, as it was a great way for them to launder money. Victor Carranza and his army were at war with almost the entire region of Boyaca, but he was single-handedly running one of the most dangerous areas of the entire world. This industry, in the mid-1970s, was valued at over $250 million a year of Colombian emerald exports, which today would be valued at approximately 5 times as much. The drug cartel saw how lucrative the emerald business was and how ripe it was for the exploitation of money and other illegal purposes. For decades, there could be 1,000 people or more on any given day who wanted Victor dead, yet he always managed to fight off and kill his enemies, remaining in control of the emerald industry. The FARC were on a murderous rampage fighting with not only Don Victor and cartel, but also the Colombian government for control of the country. Thousands of Colombians, both fighters and innocent civilians, would lose their lives. Gunfighting was not just limited to the emerald region of Boyaca, solely contained to the jungles and small villages of the countryside. They were also quite frequent in the streets of Bogota as well. For decades, Colombia is one of the most dangerous places on earth. The period of the 1970s to the 1990s were essentially a civil war in Colombia. This period would later be referred to as the Green War. Carranza would be accused of organizing the murders of not only the cartel, but of his rival businessmen and local farmers who would occasionally storm his properties. It was during one of these raids in his mines where his men killed hundreds of rivals. He would eventually have to stand trial for the slaughter, and even though he was jailed for a brief period, it was never long. Carranza eventually negotiated a peace treaty via the Catholic Church in the mid-90s, bringing a truce which is more or less adhered to. But towards the end of his life, he saw the peace treaty begin to unravel. His control would not last forever. He was now an old man in his mid-70s, and one who had survived multiple assassination attempts by snipers and gunfighters. They even tried to poison his food on several occasions. It was not a battle with prostate cancer, for which he would proudly claim that for years he never took a single pill, but that of lung cancer, to which he would eventually succumb to on April 4th, 2013. So, recapping what I've explained to you guys so far. So, for centuries, wars have been fought, thousands upon thousands of lives lost over the conquest of Colombian emeralds. For 35 years, we have Don Victor fighting the cocaine cartel, who are also fighting the FARC, who are fighting the Colombian government, and some of the most vicious and bloody fights one can possibly imagine. One might be thinking to themselves, at this point, who would be crazy enough to ever want to get involved in such a dangerous business of hunting Colombian emeralds? Ray Zajicek. My dad was born in 1947 in Beloit, Wisconsin. He moved to Texas with my family at the age of 5 and wound up studying poli-sci and geology at what the time was called North Texas State University in the late 1960s. He spoke Spanish and knew just a little bit of Japanese thanks to his roommate. He also had a passion for business and wanted to see the world. He took a job as a translator for a Japanese company who needed someone who could speak Spanish and was willing to travel to Bogota. Not knowing much about the emerald or the stone business in general, he soon found himself negotiating the buys of the emeralds, speaking to the commissionistas in Spanish, and translating the negotiations back to the Japanese buyers. Basically, he's translating Japanese numbers. That's really all I can say. It was the early 70s. The gemstone business, even though essentially centuries old at that point, was just getting loosely organized thanks to modern traveling and shipping. And similar to that, my father was just getting started in the business as well. He immediately fell in love with the stone, and after a few years of translating, he decided that he could do a better job working for himself. He started buying emeralds for his newly formed company, Equatorian Imports, in 1972. Importing them back to the States, he wasn't sure what to do with the green gems. So he went to New York. He tried to sell his product there and quickly sold pretty much everything he had, and he realized that he just might have a future in this business. At the time, my dad was one of a few dozen gringos buying stones in Colombia. Keep in mind, this is the early 70s, and Bogota was a thriving tourist town and was very safe for families. I'm just making sure everybody's paying attention. Seriously, Bogota at the time was pretty much known for kidnapping, drugs, and murder more than it was for emeralds. It's also the cocaine capital of the world, which had shattering, long-lasting effects in the country. Stone dealers could often find themselves pressured into laundering money for the cartels. My father can recall on more than one occasion where he was approached by a cartel member who would politely encourage him to consider their business ventures and to help with imports into the US. In turn, they would help his own business. Fortunately, my father, ever the stalwart good American that he is, politely refused them at every opportunity and managed not to get shot in the process. But it wasn't just the cartel that presented problems for the emerald hunters during that period. Danger could easily be found in the streets of Bogota, and oftentimes it found you before you even knew what was happening. Our company office is located in Septima and 7th in the Emerald Trade Center of downtown Bogota. It was also located across the street of the High Court of Colombia. In November of 1985, my father and stepmother were in their offices when the bomb went off that almost blew out their windows on the 7th floor. The FARC had just begun a 2-day siege on the judges and magistrates. The army quickly moved in and sealed off their building, and for 2 days they were not allowed to leave. With very little food and water, they literally had to sit and sleep on the floor as gunshots and bombs rang out for the next 48 hours until the siege was finally over. 91 bodies would eventually be removed from the Hall of Justice, directly across the street from our office. That's the building that you see across the street is the Hall of Justice, and that would be at the end of our block, right on the corner. That's looking out of our office down into the streets. So, things sort of went from bad to worse, or at least more difficult. In 1983, my dad went to prison for faulty paperwork. He was accused of trying to steal cultural heritage from the country of Colombia. What had happened was simply sloppy paperwork on behalf of the exporter my father had paid to process the exportation of the emeralds. The exporter had rushed the job and not checked his work, which led to my father's arrest at the airport as he was trying to board the plane back to the US. His merchandise was seized, which in itself would cause any gem hunter in this room to probably have a heart attack. We all know that if your merchandise is seized in a foreign country, good luck getting it back. The police took my father from the airport to a large high-rise in downtown where they hold all those who've been arrested and awaiting trial. Murderers, drug dealers, arms dealers, members of the FARC were all housed together in the same building. After 2 weeks, my father was moved to the National Prison of Colombia. A month later, the FARC would blow up the downtown housing unit, killing hundreds of people in the process. Now, prison is not a nice place to be, and Colombian prison is even worse. My father would wake up every morning at dawn to line up in the courtyard where they were required to sing the Colombian national anthem. He can still whistle it to this day. My family visited him as much as they could. The U.S. consulate told him he had to be patient and wait. They were doing their best to get him out. There was not much that he could do in Colombian prison as a gringo. He slept on a 1-inch cot on a wet floor, took a freezing cold shower every few days, played cards, tried not to get stabbed, you know, prison life. He was in his cell quite a bit, sitting on the floor. He used his free time to make a stool so he had something to sit down on instead of the cold, wet concrete. Close to 5 months later, all charges were dropped, and my father walked out of Colombian prison, a free gringo, with a wooden stool in his hand. Oh, hold on just a second. This is the stool. Underneath, there's the signatures of some of the inmates as well as the prison guards that he made friends with and everything. So, cool little prop I got. Right. Okay, and no, my dad never did get the merchandise back. He said the loss of value at the time was approximately about $100,000. So, not to keep talking about murder and loss and all things horrible that go on in Colombia, but sadly the siege of '85 was by far the last dead body my dad would see in Bogota. My dad changed hotels often. The FBI called him one time asking what he was doing in the country. President Carter was visiting Colombia, and they were just checking in on U.S. citizens to see what they were up to. My dad did not like receiving that phone call. Not only was he trying to avoid being detected, he was always trying to find a safe place to stay. All he wanted was a safe hotel with a good food and a bar. So he found this place called the Brittania. It was run by a couple of expats from England that set it up as basically a safe house, so to speak, that other expats and military officials could come stay in when they were in Bogota. So let's see. My dad said that there were probably so many guns and trained assassins in the Brittania, it was probably one of the safest places in all of Colombia to be. So he ended up staying there for several years. One morning, he was preparing to leave for the office, and he stepped outside of the Brittania. He saw a dead body laying right in front of the street. He looked at the body, ran back inside, and he told the owner. He said, "Hey, there's a dead body lying right in front of the building." And the owner's wife looked at him, and she said, "Well, is it one of ours?" Meaning a customer. And he said, "No." And she said, "Well, then I guess you should just leave him alone." To be fair, Bogota has improved greatly over the last 20 years. It's become much safer, the FARC activity is less frequent, and the country has done a tremendous job of trying to clean up after the horrible effects of the cocaine industry. Today, it does have a thriving tourist industry and wonderful hotels. It's always had amazing food, but it's still Colombia, and a visitor should never take the country's politeness for granted. More slides here. This is the interior of the Brittania. So it had a pool table. You go upstairs to the rooms. There was, I think, like about 7 or 8 rooms upstairs. It had a bar. You could smoke inside. He loved it. It was great. Okay, so my history lesson is mostly over at this point. And I'm sure you'd probably like to hear more about the actual emerald trade and, of course, the mines. Yes, my father has been to the mines. No, I have not. I do not want a death wish. I was actually down there during the Emerald Symposium last year, and I had an opportunity to go. And I remember I was standing out in front of the hotel. Everybody was meeting in the lobby. It was 6 a.m. leave. And I called my dad, and I said, "Dad, I really don't know if I want to do this or not." And he said, "Son, don't go. It's not worth it. A mine is a mine." So I decided to take his advice. I went back upstairs and I went to bed. The next day, or the next evening, the group came back and everybody was completely disheveled. They took a couple of SUVs, packed everybody into the SUVs tightly. It's about a 7 to 9 hour drive, depending on weather conditions, on road conditions. It's extremely bumpy. People were getting sick in the cars. It was a not ideal thing. They ended up, they didn't have enough time to bring the group back that evening, so they had to make makeshift arrangements for them to stay in some of the workers' quarters that were up there. Everybody said that it was a pretty miserable time, so I think I lucked out not going. So the mines are only 200 miles north of Bogota, but as I said, it can take a full day's travel to get there. Helicopter is actually the best way to travel, but it can also be dangerous due to unpredictable weather at high altitudes. Plus, bad guys on the ground can easily shoot a helicopter just as easily as they can shoot a car. Speaking of bad guys, if you do decide to travel by car, it's best to do so in a large group, but just know this. The bad guys know when they see people, more specifically gringos, heading to the mines that they probably have money. And when they see you coming back, they realize that you probably have emeralds, so now they get to rob you twice. In all seriousness, this is why the trading and sales are not done on site like in other countries where gems are mined. Most of the real trading goes on in Bogota. After mining, the stones are passed through various sets of hands before arriving in Bogota, where they are again passed on to various owners who in turn hand them over to commissionistas who are trying to sell the stones. It is here in our office that we begin to see the material. We often sort through hundreds of stones, thousands of stones a week, hunting for beauty and value that we can then import back to the States and present to our customers. By the time we get these precious green gems back to the US, they have already passed through many hands and traveled thousands of miles. It is our job as importers buying on site in Bogota to know the journey of each one of the stones that each one has taken in order to pass along confidence to our customers and in turn the end consumer to know where their stone comes from and what has been done to each stone in the process. Picture of my dad sorting stones down in the office. So what makes an emerald good enough for Equatorian? We have many clients who have all different types of customers. Some buy for size, others for color and clarity. Some are looking for unique shapes and cuts. Trapezies are often very popular. The variety of emeralds we see every day in our office is one of the most exciting aspects of the job. We get to select the material that we deem suitable for our customers, but the job does not stop after the selection. We are always having to look for areas that we can improve the stones. Have all the facets been polished correctly? What is the correct degree of angle for the stone depending on the light? Where are the inclusions located on the stone? Do they run across the table? How much damage does the stone have? Not to mention the complications of actually trying to purchase a stone. Does the seller want us to buy other stones in the process as a lot? What kind of ridiculous prices are they asking? Having the answers to all these questions can only come from years of on-the-job experience and working with other knowledgeable experts in the field. Mistakes can easily be made and happen often if you are inexperienced in buying emeralds and do not have the knowledge to make an educated buy. In fact, the sellers often rely on the fact that foreign buyers will make mistakes, and that is where thousands upon thousands of dollars can be lost. Buying emeralds in Bogota from Colombians is not easy, and something we would encourage verdant buyers to not try on their own, unless, of course, they like to lose money. So I know Rob said no science, but I had to get this in there for Ray. So like most all-colored gemstones, emeralds go through an enhancement process before being presented to the market. The enhancement process is used to mask natural inclusions found within the beryl. These inclusions or fissures are often masked using oil or polymers, which allow light to pass through the imperfection, masking or hiding the inclusion from the human eye. They are still present within the gem, you just can't see it as well. Now, this part of my speech could have its own lengthy debate and discussion, so I'm going to try and keep it short. I'm not trying to prove which enhancement medium is better. The traditional oiling method, which has been around for thousands of years with little improvement in technology and one which will absolutely evaporate and oxidize over time, leaving the end consumer with an emerald that looks different from the way they initially purchased it, versus that of a science-based and improved technological method of a stabilized colorless polymer, which will absolutely never change, leaving the stone just as beautiful as the day the owner took it home. I'll let you guys decide. But this process is never easy and requires a great amount of detail. Again, depending on the amount of damage per se that the stone might have, where the inclusions are in the stone, stones can break during the enhancement process, and breaking means you're losing a lot of money. So you always have to be paying attention to every step of the way with the stones. It's not just seeing a stone and buying it and taking it home and putting it in a showcase. There's multiple steps in the process. You have to be very conscientious of what you're doing, constantly thinking about the stone, thinking about areas of improvements, what needs to be done. Does it represent enough value for our customers? Is it worth the buy? There's a lot of questions that you have, and they can only be answered through years and years of experience and practice, through several trips, years worth of going to Colombia and buying gemstones. So once we bring the stones back to the U.S., we go through an import process. We go through U.S. Customs, and the goods can be officially released into the country. When we arrive at our office and view our goods for the first time on our native soil, we often begin to sweat a little bit and wonder, oh my God, what have I done? What have I bought? Sometimes we see things we didn't see before. We start to sweat the small stuff. We begin to overthink it. But usually, we are very happy with our purchases and anxious to begin the process of presenting our goods to our customers. Oftentimes, our customers are waiting for us to return. They want to have the opportunity to select before others. We begin to slowly make the rounds to our customers' offices and jewelry stores, showing them our new arrivals. And hopefully, with a little luck, the phone starts to ring and business begins again. As gem dealers in the trade, most of us travel to Tucson at the start of each new year, a pilgrimage. Every January, we meet in the desert to kick off the industry with the Tucson show. Let's see. We return to the desert to associate and mingle with our existing clients and friends while meeting new customers along the way. We often run into each other in Tucson as there is much crossover between minerals and gems. While in the past the shows used to be very segregated with different locations and even different weeks hosting minerals versus gems, last year the Arkenstone was the first mineral company to participate in the AGTA Gem Fair as mineral dealers on the showroom floor. So I think that's pretty cool. Round of applause for Rob and Arkenstone. As Rob was saying, there's a lot of crossover and synergy between our two businesses. Minerals and gemstones go hand in hand. A perfect example seen was the wonderful exhibit we all saw last night at Rob's gallery, as well as the Perot Museum. We will always be intertwined amongst one another, and it's good for us to know folks on different sides of the aisles. So whether you're coming from the mineral world or the gem world, you have a background in geology or a science-related field, or perhaps you're simply a fan of both, I hope I've given you a better sense of appreciation for the Colombian Emerald business and what it takes to hunt these fascinating green gems. That's my dad down there, scrolling through some more. These are what the emeralds look like when we have to get them ready for export. We have to line them up, number the buys, the number of pieces, and the carat weights. Everything has to go through a very strict exportation process, and as you guys know, you don't want the paperwork to be screwed up. More Trapiches. This is Bogota, for those that have not been. Our office is kind of located behind that tallest building that you see there, just on the other side, in the Emerald Zone. Mountains. Old school pics of Ray, polishing a stone. And the original Tucson security team in 1979. All faces have been blacked out to preserve their identities. So thank you guys very much. I hope you enjoy my presentation.